Welcome to Bodybuilding.com's Ask the Pro panel. My name is Chris Ullery. I have the distinct honor and pleasure of hosting two fantastic experts here today. I'm joined by Dr. Jake Wilson, who's a PhD in skeletal muscle physiology, as well as Dr. Rob Wildman, who's a PhD nutritionist, I think both of whom are also certified strength and conditioning specialists. We're going to cover a wide range of topics today. We're going to talk about nutrition, supplementation, timing, basically anything under the sun that we can cover in about 30 minutes. So it should be a great conversation. Guys, I know that was a brief intro, so if you want to just add a little bit to it and kind of talk a little bit about where you guys live in the world of fitness, that would be awesome. My
lab's at the University of Tampa, so our specialty is basically skeletal muscle. How do you gain muscle tissue? How do you lose fat? Can you do it at the same time? And the latest in supplementation and also training variables that go along with that. So that's kind of like it's a 24/7 thing.
Best job in the world.
Best job in the world,
is what you're saying.
Best job in the world.
Next to my job.
Of course. Forgive me.
Yeah. So I'm based in Dallas, Texas, and I'm Chief Science Officer for Diamondized Nutrition. So I have the pleasure of designing products that people can use and get benefit from. So it's really exciting for me. I also have the pleasure of working with researchers like Dr. Jacob Wilson at University of Tampa to prove out that the products actually do what they say they do.
Absolutely. That's phenomenal. Well, since we're kind of already, just as a segue from the supplements, let's just kickstart it and go right into that realm. There's a lot of talk and numerous questions from our users about specific protein intake. And I think people often target and talk about, a specific number of grams per pound, like 1 gram per pound of body weight every day. Is that the most useful way to think about it in terms of building muscle, or is it better to think about a minimum maximum range? Or what are your guys' thoughts on the ideal protein intake?
Well, that's a real interesting topic. Basically, I think if you look at the original research on protein, what they were looking at is what happens over a 24-hour period. But really, if you look at protein balance, like protein synthesis, protein breakdown, it's regulated on a per meal basis. So what I always recommend is how much protein should you get in a single meal? And then how many meals should you have in a day? And we know it's probably anywhere from, depending on the quality, if you have whey protein, you might need as little as 20 grams. If you have chicken, you might need 30 to 40 grams of protein in that meal. And then you're going to have that fairly frequently, probably every 3 to 4 hours, and that will determine your total protein intake a day. Because look at typical Americans. They wake up in the morning, they'll have a bagel or whatever, and then at night it's football, which I'm pumped up that's coming out, and they'll have a couple steaks. Mm-hmm. So most of their protein's with dinner, but a bodybuilder might spread that out. Same amount of protein, the bodybuilder is getting more effective dosing.
So is that the best way to think about muscle protein synthesis in terms of peaking it every few hours? Is that kind of the intent with that 3 to 4 hour meal timing?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so you're sort of looking for the right amount over the course of the day at specific times.
That's right, and so if you look at the number of meals per day, if you go from 5 meals a day and you go down to 3 meals a day, that means that you need more at those 3 meals per day. Plus, at the same time, and then you just add it up. So, what Dr. Wilson was saying, it's very easy for somebody to get well in excess of 100 grams of protein, and this is really just focusing on muscle, and the getting the maximal benefit out of a training session or, a training lifestyle. But there's other benefits of protein as well that, people would want to consider. There's an effect of a thermogenic effect. It's the most thermogenic nutrient, so it's very strategic if you want to burn more calories throughout the day. It's the most satiating of the macronutrients. So if you're looking to sort of minimize and pull back your caloric intake because you are trying to either cut some weight or whatever, you need to bring your protein up, not only to meet your needs for muscle, but you got to go beyond muscle and meet your other needs as well.
Exactly.
Well, and so let's talk about dosage for different weights. I think you kind of mentioned based on the source, say 20 to 30 grams. But if I'm a 200 versus a 250 pound guy, do I want to increase that? Or as soon as I turn on muscle protein synthesis with the right dose, do I need to go over? Is there any benefit to adding more protein per meal?
That's a great question. Well, I think Dr. Rob definitely brought some other benefits besides protein synthesis, like satiety, the thermic effect. And we're always thinking about protein synthesis. But if you look, what about staying lean, overall? There's body fat issues as well. And one of the things that bodybuilders deal with all the time is they diet down, they lose a bunch of body fat, and then most of them rebound in that next month and gain a ton of fat. Well, there's a recent study that came out of Dr. Joey Antonio's lab where basically what they did is they overfed people on protein. I'm not saying that I recommend this, but they gave like 4 grams per kilogram, 4.5 grams per kilogram. It's like, over 2 grams per pound, and they didn't gain any fat. So someone's coming out of a contest, it's hard to gain fat eating more protein. So maybe if you've been in a calorie deficit for a long time, you raise your protein intake up to get your metabolism back up. That's irrespective of maximizing protein synthesis.
Yeah, and certainly the timing of the next meal as well. So if you train in the afternoon and this is your meal after, and you're not going to eat again until either right before bed or not at all, I mean, you definitely will gain greater benefit by having a higher protein intake at that meal. And we haven't even begun to touch on like nighttime.
Oh yeah,
and
exactly.
6 to 8 hours of sleep when most people aren't digesting and absorbing protein at all. I mean, how strategic do we need to be right before bedtime?
Yeah, let's chat about that a little bit. I suppose the other end of the protein spectrum for muscle, not necessarily synthesis, but minimizing protein breakdown, especially overnight when, you're kind of devoid of nutrients for that period of time. What is the right approach before bed? What's the ideal meal, I guess, to sort of hopefully keep yourself anabolic or at least minimize that breakdown so you're in a good position the next day to train again or, before you break your fast?
Yeah, I think the word that you used is right, to consider it more of like a meal and to think about it along the same lines that you would think about other meals throughout the day. So you're going to want to hit a minimal protein intake level. You're going to want to drive leucine up to above 2 grams during that time. I mean, because it's going to be a long stretch during the overnight period. I think where things will move to in the future is, how do you potentiate that? How do you extend it out? Is there time released options? Because it is a pretty significant period of time. And I don't know if we really understand that whole nighttime, what's happening at night and how much protein we really do break down over that period of 6 to 8 hours. But, we did some back of the napkin mathematics on it, and it came out around 10 to 15 grams for an average size individual like myself that you would lose over the course of it. It doesn't sound like a lot, but when you start adding it up over the course of a month, then it equates to about a pound of protein that you would lose during sleep. So, then you're thinking first thing in the morning, and how important is that morning meal almost as soon as you get up, and then what should that look like as well?
Exactly right. Yeah, the thing is, we really have very little studies on actual, protein balance throughout the night and stuff like, or how to optimize nutrition throughout the night. What I can tell you, the studies that we do have tell us that your gut and your metabolism functions at night like it would in the day. I remember when I was in grad school, like a lot of people just trying to put on mass, you wake up in the middle of the night and have a protein shake, right? Well, maybe there's something to that. We haven't tested that, but that's one of the studies we're thinking about doing in our lab. Just real simple, just middle of the night, just have guys chug a protein shake or a placebo and see what happens, right? Yeah,
very common practice.
Yeah.
A lot of the bodybuilders that I worked with, when I was faculty, that's exactly what they do. They'd set their alarm clock, hit the button, knock it down, and go right back to sleep.
Yeah.
So in terms of the composition of those meals, when you're bookending your sleep, can we at least say, different sources are better at those times, like casein is more ideal before bed because of that slow release, and whey would be ideal in the morning? Or is it too general to say that?
There's like 2 schools of thought, I would say. Short end of it, there's not a lot of studies putting them head to head before bed.
Okay. That's
what I say. There's some kind of new recent research coming out on it, but not like a ton comparing the 2 going before bed. I mean, whey protein is great for increasing protein synthesis. The theory behind casein is that it's long lasting. How that pans out in the middle of the night, I don't know.
But I think you have to apply like some of the other studies that were done, putting different proteins head to head, whether it's whey, casein, soy, and then maybe other vegetable proteins, and looking at the impact. How quickly do the amino acids rise, and do you get above a leucine threshold? Yeah. So it would almost seem like you would need an extended acting protein that would definitely get your leucine up over a threshold level. So, if you use casein, you might need to use more of it. If you use whey, then you might want to blend whey and casein to get it up and then let the casein carry it for a couple of hours.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and Dr. Rob makes a great point on this. If you look with casein, you look at whey, you give 20 grams of each, casein's going to be down here, whey's going to be up here, but casein's longer lasting. So maybe if you double the dose, maybe if you had 40 grams or something like that, 30, 40 grams, it hits that threshold and it stays elevated for a long time. One thing I will say about nighttime feeding, and I want to emphasize this for any athlete who's out there, any recreational athlete, they don't have to, be in a contest or things like that, is the importance of sleep in general. So maybe the best thing for pre-bed is something that's going to enhance your sleep overall. So like we know, for example, magnesium before bed enhances sleep. I always recommend maybe even there's sleep monitoring systems that people can get to see how well are they sleeping. Black everything out before you go to bed, like dark, completely black. Don't check your cell phone 100 times in the middle of the night. If you wake up in the middle of the night, most people do at one point, down the shake, go back to bed, but really try and set up an environment. Your bed should be comfortable. But what happens is if you don't sleep, you become insulin resistant, you're hungrier the next day. What you eat has a greater probability of turning into fat. So what you do for bed can impact your nutrition and your metabolism the entire day, and that can impact your training adaptations.
And so that's all endocrinology. Is that hormonal because you're not getting the same hormonal response with a lack of sleep? Is that the idea?
Yeah, a lot of it could be. And you become, the main hormone that gets impacted, a lot of it is insulin. You become insulin resistant. And we all know that you don't want to be insulin resistant if body composition is the goal.
When you guys talked about leucine specifically and the importance of hitting a certain threshold or getting a certain amount to go past that threshold, so leucine, one of the branched chain amino acids, I just kind of wanted to cover, why is leucine so important? What makes it kind of, why are you focusing on that specifically?
Go ahead.
All right. So, here's the thing. We have 20 amino acids, right, that make up a protein. And for years, scientists were trying to figure out, is it just protein or is there certain, aspects of the protein that are doing it? So this one scientist, Dr. Garlick, came out. He actually worked with my brother when he was doing his doctorate. And what he did was he took all the amino acids and basically lined them up. And the only one that could stimulate protein synthesis by itself was leucine. So that's one of the branched chain amino acids, like the side chain branches. So basically now we know protein quality, like Dr. Rob said, seems to be based on this leucine content. Like you can give the same amount of protein for months, and if one's low quality and one is higher quality, has more leucine, body composition will be so different, drastically different, just with this one amino acid. So, there seems to be sort of a threshold, which Rob was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is muscle is just highly responsive. I think of the tissue in the body that is most responsive to either stressors or nutritional balance or whatever it is. I mean, it's adipose tissue and it's skeletal muscle. I mean, skeletal muscle, a lot of times, it just reacts. And based on the challenge, it changes to get bigger, stronger, faster, more enduring, whatever it is. It also responds to nutrients and nutrient intake because it has to. It has to be signal as to when food is coming into the body. Leucine, the highest content in leucine as in a protein is milk. So it makes sense that there's a signal in there that babies' bodies received when they consumed milk. And this is across all mammals. So, it makes sense that there is some type of signaling amino acid in there that was found in milk, that was part of our first food, that is also important to us throughout our entire lifespan. And it's becoming even more important as we age as well, because the signal for leucine and the impact that it has may actually be desensitized as we get older. So there's a lot of research going on in that area now, and looking more specifically at leucine, how aggressive should we be targeting it? Do older individuals need more leucine to get that same trigger effect as maybe somebody who's young and spry like Dr. Wilson here? But those of us on the other end who aren't looking through binoculars, they're kind of looking more through a magnifying glass at the rest of their life. I mean, we're hyper aware of getting more leucine into our diet.
Well, and so this may be slightly hypothetical, but knowing what you know now, given all the protein research, all the research on leucine, what would the ideal protein supplement label look like? What does it contain?
Well, one thing it definitely contains is like pure protein. I'd say that's one of the number one things that you can have, because you can put a lot of stuff in there as sort of fillers. So I was like, is this actual protein? And then look for the leucine content. Every serving should have 2 to 3 grams. I think those are the two of the simplest things that I would recommend when looking on a label.
When you mentioned pure protein, and I don't want to go too far into this topic, but there's been some press recently about amino spiking or protein spiking. So how do you sort of look beyond the label to figure out, that my protein is actually 20 grams of whey and not necessarily 14 or 15 grams with a lot of extra glycine or taurine or something to make it look like it's 20 grams of whey?
The Dr. Rob's the expert on this one.
Well, we just have to be detectives. As consumers, we have to, look at the product that we're buying and ask the basic questions. If a product is $5 cheaper or $10 cheaper for like a 3-pounder or a 5-pounder, why is that? Is it just on discount, or is there, is it formulated less expensively? One of the ways you can formulate a product less expensively and still hit a protein level on your nutrition facts panel is by adding other amino acids or other factors like creatine derived from amino acids that has nitrogen in it. So really you just have to look at the ingredients that are on the back. And as Dr. Wilson said, if it just says, like whey protein or soy protein or whatever protein you're targeting, and then it goes into things like flavors and sweeteners, you're golden. But when you begin to see, the list just sort of broadening out, and you begin to see things like creatine or not branched chains, but creatine or glutamine or glycine or taurine, then you have to ask some questions. How much is in there and how much of the protein claim is counting for that? So, recently there's been some good guidance laid out by CRN and APA for how brands should be labeling protein on their package. And they've also submitted those recommendations to the FDA to help change how products are labeled in the future. I think it's really going to help consumers and to buy exactly what they're buying. 'Cause when you buy a protein supplement or you buy a protein product, you are targeting protein. I mean, that's what you want.
Right.
Exactly.
But Dr. Wilson's right. I think the best barometer is a specific call out to leucine content, because nobody's going to add leucine to spike it, because leucine's more expensive than the protein that's in there. So if it calls out 2 grams of leucine or 2.5 grams of leucine, that's really helpful information, and that should be the barometer at which somebody looks at this and almost determines the value of that protein.
Exactly.
That's great. Well, let's dive into your shaker bottles for a second. Just kind of take me through a day in the life of each of your shaker bottles. What's in your shaker bottle throughout the day at specific times?
Yeah, okay, well, I'm a scientist, so I'm always putting a lot of stuff in the shaker bottle, a lot of stuff people are not aware of yet. But I would say, obviously, I'm a big fan of whey protein. So I have whey protein definitely in my shaker bottle. I have a lot of different supplements. People who know me know I have HMB in the shaker bottle. And other metabolites of leucine I will put in there. Creatine, we were talking earlier, Dr. Rob and I, it should be, honestly, I think it should be a nutrient. It has so many different impacts. Everyone just thinks muscle. So many other things besides that actually go in there. And then I have things that enhance my cognitive function. So, there's certain phospholipids, which we can talk about later, like phosphatidylserine, helps cognitive function, helps buffer stress, and other phospholipids as well that I'm looking into, like phosphatidic acid. So before bed, my shaker bottle has those sleep aids as well, like magnesium, and things like that. So that's kind of like what I usually have in my shaker bottle any given time.
That's great.
Yeah. So my kids, they kid around with me, and they can hear that sound several times over the. Like, oh, there's Dad's
Blender
music
ball
again.
flying
Yeah. So I mean, I'd like to have it in a holster, because I'll use my shaker 5 to 6 times a day easily. So usually in the morning it's a pre-workout, and in that pre-workout I'll have things like pomegranate extract, beetroot extract, because I want the polyphenols and some nitrates, a caffeine source in there, maybe some natural tea sources in there. I think that's fantastic. Plus the creatine I'll have in there, and some branched chain amino acids, usually 3 to 5 grams of branched chain amino acids I'll have in there as well, and just shake that up before I go to the gym. And for me, most importantly, I just want to dial in, concentrate, focus. I want the amino support, going in. Plus, I want to sort of get that pre-circulation going, that the pomegranate and the beetroot seem to do so well. Very, very exciting area of sport nutrition moving forward is pomegranate and beetroot. Exciting stuff. After training, usually it's protein shake, whey protein. I may add a little extra creatine in there as well. Pretty simple at that point, and then I'm off to a meal about an hour and a half later. So usually for me that's a bridge, the post-workout period. Just get my leucine up, sort of spike it out, and then move into my meal after that. And then throughout the day, what's really important for me is really just, as I consume beverages, I want to maximize the value of the beverages throughout the day. So I'll use, branched chain amino acids, combination of, different products that will have branched chain amino acids, a little bit of citrulline, taurine. I like to get taurine throughout the day. I think there's some really nice data on the combination of taurine and branched chain amino acids throughout the day, during a workout, and then throughout the day to help in the recovery process and reduce soreness. For somebody like me, making my day more comfortable, but being able to train hard is everything. I moan and I groan every time I get up now. So if I can minimize that and I can get back into the gym as quickly as possible and have a great workout, that's really, really important to me. So the shaker cup is always active.
Yeah, that's a good thing Dr. Rob brought up was the branched chain amino acids. Like we travel all the time, and I love being home, but it just doesn't happen as much. And when you're on the road, you might only be able to get 3 meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner. So what research has shown, like my brother, Dr. Gabe Wilson, Dr. Doug Patton Jones has shown is that if you have branched chain amino acids between your meals, you basically stimulate so much more protein synthesis throughout the day. It's also another way to be calorie efficient. You can trigger the same response of muscle growth with less calories, maybe 30 calories or something like that with the branched chain amino acids. So I typically will at least 1 or 2, and if I'm on the road 3 times, have branched chain amino acids between my meals.
And 5 to 10 grams, or?
Yeah, about that. As long as I have, usually it's the 2 to 1 ratio of leucine to isoleucine, just because that's the composition of muscle, and that's what all the research has been done.
So talking about specific applications for BCAAs versus whey, you kind of talked a little bit about using BCAAs to bridge meals. Would whey have the same effect and you're just using BCAAs because it's more calorie efficient, or is one better than another in that sense?
Well, I think it just, we've talked a lot about, looking at your total day. We talked about sleep or what, and how much you should have at different meals. So I really just think it's a matter of surveying your entire day and whether or not you want that extra protein in there, or do you just want to kind of raise your branched chain levels in your blood a little bit more. You may have already had a big meal like 2 hours prior, and you got another one coming. So maybe another whey shake may not make the most sense at that point. Maybe just the bridge BCAAs, and that's where a lot of my focus is a lot of times when I hit the shaker with the BCAAs and in the afternoon and in the early evening.
Yeah, like I guess not so cool things, but 3 hours after you eat a meal, you kind of stop synthesizing proteins, right? But the thing is, you have all these amino acids in your blood left over from the meal. So all you need is the signal. You just got to turn the signal on, and that's where branched chain amino acids is. So if you had whey, you're just kind of adding to the pool. Don't get me wrong, that would turn the signal on as well. But if you already have the amino acids, why not just trigger protein synthesis since you already have the building blocks in your blood?
Gotcha.
Great point.
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to go in. So people with intermittent fasting talk a lot about, fasted autophagy, right? Like using what you've already got in your body. But it seems like it's kind of an undiscussed subject when it comes to intermittent fasting. So it's interesting to hear you bring up using what you've already got, right? So that's kind of a neat point. Random tangent. Yeah. You talked briefly about pre and post workout shake and the composition of those shakes. For a long time, it feels like the anabolic window, this post workout time, 15 to 45 minutes post workout, was the thing for supplement manufacturers. But is there still that same emphasis, or is there a more important shake pre or post workout? What's kind of the strategy there?
Well, this is probably one of the more controversial topics that are out there. I'll tell you that for sure. There's actually only been really 2 studies looking at this, and one of them, probably the highest end one, was done by Dr. Paul Cribb. And basically what Paul Cribb did was he gave protein and creatine before exercise and after exercise, or he gave it with breakfast and dinner. And the group that had it before and after exercise had larger muscle fibers, larger muscles using MRI. And so this was gold standard. It was published in the top journal in our field. Based on that, I would say it certainly can't hurt, having, but one of the things that Dr. Rob and I have talked about is that, if you wake up in the morning and have a big breakfast, and then you're going to train like an hour and a half later, that was your pre-workout meal. You don't necessarily go, I got to down a shake because of the Paul Cribb study. You already have amino acids in your blood at that point. So that is a timing issue, but if you wake up cold fasted, he's training in the morning, then that pre-workout is going to be huge because you probably should have nutrients. One thing we do know is that if you train on an empty stomach without nutrients, then you will actually not optimize protein metabolism. In fact, you'll be in negative protein balance. This means you're losing muscle until you get nutrients. So a lot of people will go, oh, the window lasts for 24 hours. Yeah, but it fades. And you know what? Let's say it was the same amount for 24 hours. Why not take advantage of every minute? That's always my thought. So I could wait 3 hours because it lasts 24 hours. Okay, but why are you not taking advantage of those 3 hours,
Gotcha.
That's my thought.
I think the right way to look at it is there sort of a post-workout period where the muscle is primed to optimize muscle protein synthesis and have an impact of nutrition? And the answer is clearly yes. So is there potential for nutrient timing? Absolutely. And then Dr. Wilson makes the point that if you had a big meal before you trained, you still have the residual effect of that meal for a few hours afterwards. So, do you have to run and knock down a quick shake immediately after? Probably not, but it wouldn't hurt. And you should be thinking about your next protein-dense meal, soon after you train anyway, because that would be part of your normal day anyway. So, I think nutrient timing is very, very real. But actually putting the food in there or the supplement in there really depends on what your day looks like.
Sure. Yeah. So one of my top guys in my lab, Ryan Lowry, is doing a lot of research on what to eat in the morning, what to eat for breakfast, what to eat before your workout. And he pointed out a recent study to me. It was real cool. How a lot of times, especially college students, I'm at the University of Tampa, so they're like, I'm going out tonight, I'm going to party, right? And so they'll go in, they'll train as hard as they can. It's like, I can go eat whatever I want, drink whatever I want. Well, there's a recent study where they basically had people eat kind of like that, but they did it before they trained or after they trained. And the ones that did it before they trained, after several weeks, had half the body fat. Their body fat was much lower. So my point is, it seems that having a lot of your nutrients before you train can prevent negative things in fat gain. And I think so. That's important. That's kind of a nutrient timing thing.
Right. Yeah. And that's because you're utilizing that fuel when you train?
Yeah, possibly that, maybe training just turns on signals that prevents you from storing a lot of that. Whereas maybe when you're in recovery mode, you're more prone to store certain nutrients. We're really trying to look further into this.
So kind of talking about, you mentioned a lot of studies that kind of bridges the gap to a topic I'd love to chat about for a little bit. And that's sort of science versus bro science. And one being, specific measurable stuff in the lab with the desired outcome. And the other being, it doesn't have to be derogatory. A lot of people say bro science and, they're kind of demeaning it. But there's probably a lot of value in what guys are figuring out and trying in the gym. So I guess just broadly to start, what's your thoughts on the topic itself, kind of on that conversation?
Well, I'll tell you what, it's real interesting. We were talking about this earlier, but basically, traditionally with scientists, you have the guy with glasses, the lab coat, who's never been in the gym, doesn't know what a weight looks like, and they're studying protein synthesis, right? So you have this guy over here, and basically if I tube feed this or give a cell this happens, right? Then you have the bro over here, and they're like, what did he just say, right? So how is that relevant to me, this molecular pathway? So what Dr. Rob and I are trying to do is say, hey, wait, what is this guy interested in? What is a practical question? He has some practical questions. He's living it in the gym, day in and day out, maybe 2 times a day, maybe training 6-7 days a week, giving everything he or she has. We want to find out what are those questions they need to be answered. So what we're trying to do is bridge the gap between science and application. We actually want to know, what are they interested in? What are they going through? It's important to know, like, hey, like, even if it's somewhat bro science, like, hey, bro, like, I'm telling you, this works. Like, I'm telling you, dude, this works. Well, we actually pick that up. We listen and go, maybe that could be true. And let's test it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, and a lot of times I think the bro science can lead the laboratory science, and I think this is probably the case with like nocturnal nutrition, or the idea of, guys have been doing this, guys and gals have been doing this for decades now. Setting the alarm clock and knocking down protein in the middle of the night. They look at an opportunity, yet and they see what's happening during the night, and they're like, how can I reverse that? How can I address that? Well, what does the research say? There is none. There's no research in that area. So they go ahead and they're just going to do it. They're not going to wait. So, that's an example of, where sort of that what's happening in the real world eventually is driving, the laboratory studies that, Dr. Wilson is doing and other labs are now doing. And I think that, this is one of those really, really fun times where there's more practical research happening. And I think there's more interaction between industry and universities, more now than ever before. Usually, in the past, it's been more separated. Coming from an academic background, industry was looked upon, in a completely different way than it is today. Today is, federal funding kind of tightens up for research grants. Industry becomes more of a driver for a lot of research programs.
Right.
In sport nutrition, there is more dollars going into universities to test out some of these more practical applications and finished products. Because I think that's what we really need to know is, the claims that are made on packages. Is there actual research on the finished product?
Which could be a blend of ingredients instead of one
that's
specific, right?
That's right. It's just incredibly important. And I think, now we're just seeing more and more research on finished products that include multiple ingredients that, is really helpful to consumers to make smart decisions.
100%, yeah.
So they really sort of are both essential in that they might fuel one another.
I think so. I think they're melding.
Oh, 100%. And like a lot of where I came from, scientists would look down like on, they're just training, they don't know what they're talking about. No, they do. And they've actually been going through this a long time. They're saying some valid stuff. You just need to pick up on it and test it out. I can name probably 100 things off the top of my head that was considered bro science that now we know is, that's the mechanism people grow. Like, look, Arnold talked about, the pump, right? And so a scientist 10 years ago would laugh at that. Oh yeah, whatever. Now, we think that's one of the 3 major mechanisms that makes you grow, actually getting a huge pump. And actually it's something that Dr. Rob and I are doing some research on, is seeing what happens if you maximize the pump. Will that maximize protein synthesis? We know if you take cells and actually cause them to swell, they stimulate protein synthesis right there in every cell type, including muscle. I definitely think it's something that we as scientists have to consider. And I would say that to the person in the gym, try and interact with us as much as possible, and let's feed off each other.
I do kind of want to talk a little bit about new research, because we've kind of gone into that territory a little. But you brought up, mechanisms of muscle growth, and the pump, or metabolic stress. You kind of want to cover the other 2 and sort of their in-gym application for somebody looking to build muscle, how they would apply those.
Yeah, sure. So we have obviously the pump, like I said, Dr. Rob's doing a lot of research on that right now. So that's going to be higher repetitions, short rest period lengths, just trying to drive fluid into the cell. Could be hydration status, The other mechanism is going to be like metabolic stress. People talk about, they feel that pain, when they're doing supersets, giant sets. That's things like lactic acid and a lot of other things besides lactic acid, a lot of what we call metabolites that we know actually trigger growth. One of my friends, Dr. David Gunderman, took cells, muscle cells, put lactic acid on them, and it's simulated protein synthesis. So we know the more you get in there, the better it goes. Then the last thing, which you kind of say is 1 or 2 different mechanisms, is mechanical stress, which leads to muscle damage. and inflammation. You could say, well, are all of three of those things mechanisms? The actual mechanical stress you have on the muscle, the damage you have in your muscle, the inflammation, are they three separate? Does the mechanical stress lead to the other two? We're not sure, but we know those are important for growth. And so that means that you basically need to go in the gym and lift heavier weights. That's one thing, yeah. It's one thing William Kramer, one of the top strength conditioning scientists in the world, said. He's like, look, I even tell my daughter this, you need to squat heavy. So it's like, that's awesome. So, the thing, it's true though, right? So, lifting heavier weights is going to be a stimulus. Training to the pump is going to be a stimulus. Building up metabolic stress is going to be a stimulus for growth, and you need to factor all those in.
Yeah, I think if we know anything now, we know that muscle is highly complex. And there's numerous factors which trigger internal signals, which causes the muscle to change in the direction in which it's being challenged. So muscle is just highly responsive that way. If you train, high intensity aerobic, then a lot of the protein synthesis that occurs will become, in the area of more aerobic enzyme systems and so forth to make you better at that. If you train high intensity, resistance training, then you gain proteins that will help you get stronger, more powerful, and bigger. So it actually doesn't make sense for muscle to miss an opportunity to see some type of metabolite or to register some type of event or mechanical damage or whatever, not register it and not feed it into the processes that will help it adapt over time. So, it's great. It's almost like a buckshot approach, all these different factors feeding in and, helping drive muscle in the direction.
100%. And, one of the things I really want to emphasize, you talk about nutrition and sport nutrition, and you talk about training. A lot of athletes will view them almost as separate entities, but they interact with each other. So, I got to stay hydrated. Well, if you're a bodybuilder, why? Maybe it enhances that pump, that cell swelling. So you want to think, why am I doing this? And how does it interact with training? All the time, you can't separate the two. Someone might go, this supplement doesn't do anything for me. It doesn't work. I've tried it. And then you look at their training split, and it's kind of pansy-ish, right? So, it's like,
they're not causing enough damage to warrant the use of it.
Exactly, yeah. There's a recovery aid. You're not training hard. Therefore, don't expect it to work, right? So, that's always the thing is you got to emphasize there's this interaction between the two.
Well, I think we've got time for probably one more question. I think we might be a little over. But I do just, since you're kind of both on the bleeding edge of research, just want to ask, what are you most excited about sort of in the research world, whether it's, a supplement study or something more directly with training or nutrition?
Oh, wow. We're excited about a lot of things. I'm going to try and narrow this one down.
Top three, maybe.
Yeah, nutrient programming. What we think is that basically you can program your metabolism when you wake up in the morning. And it's very controversial because nutrition's very controversial in general. I talk about training like, that's it, that's awesome. You talk about nutrition, and if it's different than what someone's been thinking, it's like, oh my God, no, that's false.
Religious
I know
belief almost.
Nutrition's like religion. So the thing to think about though is that what you eat for breakfast does program your metabolism the rest of the day. And so actually, you lose 15 grams of protein overnight. I know Dr. Rob says when you wake up in the morning, you should optimize protein intake. But what do most people do in the morning? They wake up, they have a ton of carbohydrates, right? Because you need energy. You've drained it overnight. Well, in actuality, if you're lifting weights, your muscle glycogen, your muscle carb stores are intact. Your liver's somewhat depleted, but your muscle's kind of intact. So what we found is, what we've been testing in our lab, Ryan Lowry's been doing a lot of work in my lab on this, is basically wake up in the morning, you have a lower carb, higher fat breakfast, things like medium chain triglycerides, eggs, things like that. And the rest of the day, you will use more fat as fuel, irrespective of how many carbohydrates you have throughout a whole day. Yeah. So basically, I'm talking about people are like, it doesn't matter if, as long as you hit a certain macronutrient range, it doesn't matter when you hit it. But we're finding with research that's not actually true. So if you have low carb for breakfast, it doesn't matter, irrespective of how many carbs. If you had 300 grams of carbs for the day, if you had most of them at breakfast, you'd actually fix your metabolism to use carbs the rest of the day as fuel. So what we're trying to look into a lot is what should you do to optimize breakfast and nutrient programming.
And I know you've got an answer too. Before we hop off that subject of kind of meal composition, is there an adaptation period, or is that 24 hours, you know, if I say, for example, woke up and had high fat, high protein breakfast, would I automatically program the rest of my day, or is there sort of an adaptation period required where kind of like keto adaptation, where I need to do that for a certain amount of time before it really takes effect?
Yeah, that's actually something we're also doing research on. we look for this. We just did a huge study on ketogenic dieting. But yes, so you have acute adaptation and long-term adaptations. You do see effects that day, but it gets better because you become more insulin sensitive. You become more, we call metabolically flexible, and that only improves over time. But any diet or any intervention that you use is going to take a couple weeks. And actually, like with ketogenic dieting, with our research, we found after the first week they felt horrible. After 2 weeks, like, oh, this is great. I'm eating like bacon and you know,
the world of fats.
This is awesome,
fats.
and I'm like leaning up. You know, but there's always a period of adaptation. But one thing, just anecdotally, when we've worked with ketogenic athletes, 6 months they actually feel better than the 2 week point.
Wow.
It's a long process for sure.
And how low is there a carb threshold for that 6 months? Do you gradually increase it, or does it stay pretty low, like an induction?
Yeah, what we've definitely found is like to get in, for most people, their fat's got to be like, and everyone's like, what the hell? You know, to get in, you got to have 75% fat, 20% protein,
that's a lot of fat,
and 5% carb, right? So it's, you know, keto-friendly foods are like bacon and eggs and whole cream. Your body, yes, there's a 2 week, maybe 2 week adaptation period, but it gets better with time, I would say.
That's great.
Yeah.
What about you, Rob? Any exciting research insights?
You know, I think for me, I mean, the top three would be one, that we seem to be in the decade of protein. I mean, we're finally focused on protein. Being in nutrition, being schooled back in the 80s, being a registered dietitian, you know, protein was sort of, you know, that left behind nutrient. Can't go above 15% of total calories. Can't go above 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. Why? Because you leach calcium from your bones and your kidneys shut down. You know, it was basically the forgotten nutrient of the three. We went through, you know, low fat, high carb. We went through low carb. I mean, we've gone through all these, but I think the thing that we're really focused on now is the importance of protein throughout the day and trying to better understand how to make it work for you, because it's a nutrient that wants to work for you better than any other nutrient that we're ingesting right now. You know, beyond muscle, you know, satiety, thermogenesis, and others, you know, hair, skin, nail beauty, you know, recovery from injury, whatever it may be, the foundation of all that is going to be protein. So I'm really, really excited that we are, you know, in hyperdrive when it comes to protein research and protein research in more practical applications. The other things that I really like, before I get to creatine, which is my outside of protein is one of my favorite nutrients, is that we're beginning to look at ways to potentiate protein. So, and I think this is really important, that as we begin to realize that we need more protein, especially as we get older, you know, our needs for protein are probably increased over, you know, the younger years by percentages of like, you know, 20% or so. So, but at the same time, we may be sort of calorie restrained, or, you know, we may not want to eat that much food, or whatever the reason is. So how do we potentiate the protein that we ingest, so that maybe, you know, what was 30 grams of protein yesterday may only be 15 grams of protein tomorrow with the right potentiating factors. And I think like Stu Phillips' lab has done some really nice stuff with lower amounts of whey protein, but that has been augmented with leucine, and you get sort of a comparable impact on muscle as you do with 25 grams of whey. So the idea is that trigger nutrients like leucine may be able to reduce the amount of total protein that you need to consume. So I think that's really, really exciting. And the last is, you know, I always like to talk about creatine. And just as, you know, a creatine consumer for 20 years, get your creatine in your diet.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things that we now understand about creatine, you know, beyond muscle. And even application of muscle, sarcopenia, metabolism, bone health, neurodegenerative diseases later in life, you know, all of these things may be, you know, positively impacted by, you know, prophylactic creatine consumption over the decades before. And, you know, I just think that's absolutely critical. And you know, Jake made the point earlier, maybe we need to begin to look at it more as kind of an essential nutrient, because it's very, very difficult to get efficacious levels of creatine in the diet on a regular basis. I mean, if you're trying to get 5 or 6 grams, I mean, it becomes, fairly challenging. So, how do we do that? Supplementation seems to be the way to do it.
Awesome. Well, just as kind of a quick ending takeaway, we talked about efficacious dose. So not even to get into different forms of creatine, but just with creatine monohydrate for people who want to harness and take advantage of all those benefits for, performance as well as health. What's sort of the just dosing strategy long term? Do you need to cycle off it, or can you kind of maintain?
I think you maintain. I think there's no reason to let go of it at all. And I mean, you can go through lapses, and that's the beauty of creatine. I mean, if you look at muscle saturation of creatine, you can go through periods where and I asked you earlier, do you have some creatine? Because I didn't pack it, and if I go a day without it, I'm okay. If I go 2 days without it, I start to get worried. But you do actually have a few days that if you miss it, and you can come back and for average individuals, I'd say anywhere between like 3 and 6 grams, depending on size, is probably, women probably sliding more, down towards 3. And then as you train harder and as you get bigger and accumulate more muscle mass, or, I think you're up in the 5 to 6 gram. So somewhere around like 0.06 grams per kilogram body weight will get you there. And, I think that's good. I don't think there's any reason to cycle off of it.
Yeah, I haven't seen any.
And it's safe. I mean, there's been a lot of research. We did some research, some cardiovascular research using loading doses. And if anything, the effect that we found on the heart, maybe it strengthened the contraction of the heart. It's an inotropic effect that was really kind of interesting. But there was no negative effects of it whatsoever. And there's been a lot of long-term studies that suggest that it's, that's benign.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining us on this edition of the Pro Panel. If you've got any questions whatsoever for our pros or our experts, please just drop a note in the comments below. Feel free to sound off. Or connect with these guys on their social channels if you guys kind of want to share those.
Yeah, on Twitter it's J Wilson PhD, and just Jacob Wilson on Facebook. Or you can always hit me up any other way. I'm looking forward to your guys' comments.
Yeah, so it's the Nutrition Doc on Twitter, so it's DOC, and then I have a website which is nutritiondoctor.com, and it's DR so it's the nutritiondoctor.com.
Awesome, and for more great content like this, keep coming back to Bodybuilding.com.
Awesome.